Beneath the looming walls of Damascus, where weathered stones still murmured of empires long reduced to dust, there lived a man many believed was untouchable, a man named Non, commander of the Aramean army, whose mere presence on the battlefield could shift the course of war, whose counsel kings eagerly sought, and whose orders soldiers followed without hesitation, his reputation spreading across the known world like an eagle in flight. Yet beneath the shine of polished armor and the dignity of ceremonial robes that marked his rank, his skin revealed a different truth, scarred and afflicted with leprosy, a disease no wealth could remove, no strategy could outmaneuver, and no royal decree could dismiss, leaving him a conqueror of nations who could not conquer his own flesh, a powerful warrior forced to face a weakness no sword could defeat, where strength met helplessness, pride stood before humility. And a foreign commander would one day discover that healing would not come from his own gods, but from the God of his enemies. Chapter 1. The Captive Servant Girl. The raids into Israel had become routine. Aramean soldiers would sweep down from the north, taking livestock supplies and occasionally people. Among those taken was a young girl, no more than a child, torn from everything she knew and brought into a foreign household. She had no name recorded in scripture, no monument erected in her honor, no song sung about her courage. History would remember her only as the servant girl. She became part of Non's household, attending to his wife, performing the daily tasks that kept a commander's home running smoothly. But this girl carried something more valuable than any treasure the Aramean raiders had seized. She carried faith. Despite her captivity, despite being ripped from her homeland and family, despite serving in the house of the very man whose armies had destroyed her world, she harbored no bitterness. Instead, when she learned of her master's affliction, she spoke words that would change the course of history. "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria," she told Non's wife one day, her voice carrying the certainty of one who has witnessed miracles. He would cure him of his leprosy. Think about the extraordinary nature of this moment. A captive showing compassion to her captor, a victim offering hope to her oppressor, a child from Israel proclaiming that the God of her defeated people could do what all the gods and physicians of mighty Aram could not. Her words traveled from servant quarters to the mistress's chamber, from wife to husband, from private suffering to public action. This unnamed girl, this overlooked child, might become the first link in a chain of events that would demonstrate God's power beyond the borders of Israel. She could have remained silent. She could have taken satisfaction in her master's suffering. She could have seen his disease as divine justice. Instead, she became an instrument of grace, proving that faith often speaks loudest through the voices society ignores. Chapter 2. A King's Letter. When Non heard his wife relay the servant girl's words, he faced a choice. Would he, a commander of armies, humble himself to seek help from the prophet of a conquered people? Pride warred with desperation. Disease has a way of making decisions clearer. He brought the matter to his king, the ruler of Aram, and the king responded with the full weight of royal authority. The king of Aram prepared a letter, sealed it with his signet ring, and loaded Non's entourage with gifts befitting a diplomatic mission of the highest importance. The inventory was staggering. 10 talents of silver, approximately 750 pounds of precious metal, 6,000 shekels of gold, roughly 150 pounds of the most valuable commodity in the ancient world, 10 sets of fine garments, the kind worn only by nobility woven with threads of purple and scarlet, symbols of wealth and power. The letter itself was direct, almost demanding. "With this letter I am sending my servant Edmond to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." The delegation set out, a spectacle of military might and diplomatic prestige. Chariots rolled southward toward Israel, horses' hooves thundering against ancient roads, banners snapping in the wind. Non rode at the head of this procession, a warrior seeking not conquest but cure, carrying not weapons of war but gifts of desperation. When they arrived in Samaria, the letter was delivered to Joram, king of Israel. The king broke the seal, unrolled the parchment, read the words, and his face went pale. His hands began to tremble. Without warning, he tore his robes, the traditional sign of extreme distress, and cried out to his advisors. "Am I God?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the palace chambers. "Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." From Joram's perspective, this was a political trap. Aram was asking the impossible, demanding that he perform a miracle, knowing he would fail, providing the perfect pretext for war. The gifts were not offerings but provocations. The letter was not a request, but an accusation waiting to happen. Fear gripped the palace. Counselors whispered of troop movements and military preparations. The shadow of war seemed to fall across Israel once again. But the king of Israel, in his panic, had forgotten something crucial. There was indeed a prophet in the land, and God was not limited by royal anxiety or political calculation. Chapter 3. Elisha intervenes. News of the king's distress spread quickly through Samaria. In those days, prophets often knew things before official messengers arrived. Their connection to the divine providing intelligence no spy network could match. Elisha the prophet, successor to Elijah, student of miracles, heard that the king had torn his robes in fear and despair. He sent a message to the palace, brief and confident. "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me? And he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Notice the phrasing. Not he might be healed or I will try to help him. The message contains certainty, promise, and purpose. None would know, not just experience healing, but understand its source. This was not merely about curing disease. This was about revelation, about a foreign commander encountering the one true God. The king, relieved to shift this impossible burden, sent word to Naaman. The commander and his entourage redirected their impressive procession toward the prophet's house. Can you imagine that scene? The dust clouds visible from miles away as chariots approached, the sound of horses and soldiers, the glint of armor in the sun. Non-dressed in his finest ceremonial attire, surrounded by evidence of his wealth and power, approaching the modest dwelling of a prophet, he expected ceremony equal to his station. He anticipated a grand welcome, dramatic rituals, and impressive displays of prophetic power. He was, after all, the commander of Aram's armies, carrying a king's letter and a fortune in gifts. Surely the prophet would emerge, perhaps call upon his God with raised hands and fervent prayers, perform elaborate cleansing ceremonies, make a great show of divine intervention. Naaman's expectations were about to collide with God's methods. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Instruction. Elisha did not come out. The door remained closed. The prophet, aware of the impressive entourage waiting outside his home, sent a messenger instead. Not even appearing personally to address this visiting dignitary, the messenger walked out, faced the commander of Aram's armies, and delivered instructions that would become one of the most famous prescriptions in biblical history. "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." That was it. No ritual, no ceremony, no divine fireworks, no laying on of hands, no dramatic prayers or prophetic pronouncements, just simple instructions. Go to the river, wash 7 times, be healed. The messenger delivered this message and returned inside, leaving Naaman standing there, surrounded by his soldiers, his gifts, his expectations, and his growing fury. The Jordan River, the Yam of all places, the Jordan River. Naaman knew that river. He had crossed it during military campaigns. It was not impressive. It was muddy, narrow in places. Nothing compared to the great rivers of his homeland. The absurdity of the instructions struck him like a slap across the face. This was not what he had traveled hundreds of miles to hear. This was not worthy of the gifts he brought. This was not the treatment a commander deserved. Where was the respect? Where was the acknowledgement of his status? Where was the prophet himself? The instruction felt like an insult, a dismissal, a mockery of his desperate journey. Chapter 5. Pride Confronted. Naaman turned away in a rage. His face flushed, his jaw clenched, his hands bowled into fists. All the frustration, fear, and wounded pride of a powerful man facing powerlessness came pouring out. I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God. Wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy, he said, his voice sharp with indignation. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? His reasoning made worldly sense. The rivers of Damascus were indeed clearer, cleaner, more impressive. If washing in a river was the cure, why not wash in superior rivers at home? Why travel all this way to dip in a muddy stream? The instructions seemed arbitrary, unnecessary beneath him. But hidden in his anger was the real issue. This was not about the river at all. This was about control. Nan wanted to dictate the terms of his healing. He wanted a cure that matched his expectations, that honored his position, that made sense to his military mind. He wanted to remain in control, even of his miracle. Pride, that ancient enemy of the soul, had wrapped itself around his heart so tightly that he was willing to walk away from healing rather than submit to simple obedience. He was prepared to remain diseased rather than humble himself before instructions that offended his dignity. The same pride that had driven him to greatness on the battlefield was now driving him away from wholeness. He turned his chariots around. The great procession began to withdraw, carrying its commander back toward Aram, back toward continued suffering, back toward slow death by disease. He would rather die proud than live humbled. But God was not finished with Nan yet. Chapter 6. The Servant's Wisdom. As the entourage moved away from Elisha's house, Nan's servants gathered their courage. These men had served him long enough to know his temper, to understand his pride, to recognize that this moment required careful words. They approached him, speaking with the delicate diplomacy of those who must tell powerful people truths they do not want to hear. My father, one of them began, using a term of respect and affection that softened the correction to come. If the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then? When he tells you wash and be cleansed? The logic was irrefutable. If Elisha had demanded some heroic quest, some impossible task, some test of courage or endurance, Nan would have accepted without hesitation. If the prophet had required him to climb a mountain, to fast for 40 days, to bring rare offerings from distant lands, the commander would have done it gladly. Such tasks would have matched his sense of what a miracle should cost, what healing should require. But the prophet had asked for something simple, too simple, so simple it seemed meaningless. And perhaps that was precisely the point. The servant's question exposed the contradiction in their master's thinking. He was willing to do anything except the one thing required: humble, simple obedience. Their words created a pause in Nan's rage. The rationality of their argument cut through his indignation. They were not commanding him. They were not mocking him. They were gently, carefully, respectfully showing him that his pride was costing him everything. Nan looked at these men, his servants, but also his companions, his trusted advisors. They had followed him into battle. They had watched him lead armies to victory. They had witnessed his strength and his suffering. And now they were offering him wisdom more valuable than all the military strategies he had ever devised. He made a choice. He would obey. Chapter 7. The 7 Washings. And the journey to the Jordan River was different now. The anger had drained away, replaced by something quieter. Determination, perhaps, or resignation, or the first stirrings of genuine faith. When they reached the river's edge, Non dismounted from his chariot. He removed his commander's robes, the symbols of his rank and power, and stood at the water's edge as simply a man, diseased, desperate, willing. He waded into the Jordan. The water was indeed muddy, unimpressive, ordinary. He submerged himself once, came up, looked at his skin. Nothing had changed. The leprous patches remained, mocking his hope. He went under a second time, rose again, still diseased. The water ran off his afflicted flesh, leaving it as marked as before. Third time, fourth, fifth. With each immersion, he had to choose again to believe, to continue, to trust that something was happening, even when nothing appeared to be changing. This was the test within the test, not just to obey once, but to persist in obedience when results seemed absent. Imagine the thoughts running through his mind. Was this a cruel joke? Had the prophet sent him on a fool's errand? Sixth immersion. The water closed over his head again. He stood, water streaming from his hair and beard. The leprosy remained. One more. Seven was a number of completion in Hebrew understanding, in the number of divine perfection, the number of days in creation. 7 times he must wash. 7 times he must choose humility over pride, obedience over understanding, faith over sight. He went under the 7th time. When he rose from the Jordan River on that 7th washing, everything changed. His skin was not simply improved or partially healed. Scripture says his flesh was restored like that of a young boy. The leprosy was gone completely, replaced by healthy, clean, unblemished skin. Years of disease, of social isolation, of watching his body slowly deteriorate despite all his power and wealth, erased in a moment of simple obedience. Non stood in the Jordan River, looking at his arms, his hands, touching his face, examining what had happened to him. This was not gradual improvement. This was transformation. This was miracle. This was the power of the God of Israel made manifest in his flesh. He had come to Israel as a proud commander. He emerged from the Jordan as a changed man. Chapter 8, Faith Awakens. Dripping with river water, restored in body, awakening in spirit, Non returned to Elisha's house. But this time he came not with demands or expectations. He came with wonder, with gratitude, with the beginnings of genuine faith. His entire entourage accompanied him. Soldiers who had witnessed the miracle, servants who had counseled him to obedience, attendants who had traveled this whole impossible journey. This time Elisha came out. The prophet stood before the commander, and Non spoke words that would echo through centuries of biblical teaching. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared, his voice carrying the conviction of one who has experienced the undeniable. "So please accept a gift from your servant." Everything he had brought, the silver, the gold, the fine garments, he urged upon the prophet. This was more than gratitude. And this was a man trying to make sense of an experience that had shattered his understanding of reality. In his world, healers were paid. Services rendered required payment. Power exchanged hands through transactions. He needed to give something back to balance the scales, to make this miracle fit into categories he understood. But Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," the prophet said firmly. Even when Non urged him repeatedly, he pressed the gifts upon him, insisted that he must accept something, Elisha remained adamant. The refusal itself was a teaching moment, another lesson in a day full of revelations. Healing from God cannot be purchased. Divine power is not for sale. Miracles are not transactions. This was grace freely given, unearned and unpayable. The God who healed Non wanted no payment except what the commander had already offered without realizing it: humility, obedience, and awakening faith. But Non, struggling to grasp this new theology, made one more request. If he could not pay for the miracle, Perhaps he could at least take something back with him that would connect him to this God who had healed him. "If you will not accept payment," he said, "then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." And the request reveals so much about his transformation and his continued journey of understanding. He still thought in terms of geography and physical connection, that to worship the God of Israel, he needed soil from Israel. His theology was incomplete, his understanding still developing, but the sincerity was undeniable. He was declaring exclusive devotion to the God who had healed him, planning to bring Israel's God into his homeland, preparing to worship in Aram with earth from Israel under his feet. He made one more confession, revealing the complexity of his situation. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." He was describing his duty as commander, accompanying his king into the temple of Aram's gods, supporting the king physically as he bowed, required by his position to participate in rituals he could no longer believe in. He was asking for grace in the midst of complicated realities, seeking to balance newfound faith with political obligations. Elisha's response was gentle. "Go in peace. No condemnation, no lecture, no demands for immediate perfect theological understanding or complete separation from his culture. Just blessing and release." The prophet recognized that faith is a journey, and that transformation happens in stages, that God is patient with those taking their first steps toward him. Non-departed, no longer just healed, but converted, no longer just cleansed, but changed, carrying with him earth from Israel and a story he would tell for the rest of his life. Chapter 9. A Converted Heart. As Nun's chariots rolled away from Elisha's dwelling, they carried more than a healed commander. They carried a testimony that would spread through Aram and beyond. The servants who had witnessed everything would tell the story. The soldiers who had stood guard during the 7 washings would describe what they saw. The commander himself would become a living witness to the power of Israel's God. Consider what Nun was bringing back to Damascus: 2 mule loads of Israeli soil, yes, but also a completely changed worldview. He had come seeking physical healing and received spiritual transformation. He had arrived as a worshiper of Aramean gods and was returning as a devotee of the God of Israel. He had traveled south as a proud military leader and was journeying home as a humble servant of the divine. His request for soil reveals the early, incomplete nature of his understanding, but also the sincerity of his conversion. In the ancient world, gods were often thought to be territorial, connected to specific lands and peoples. Nun believed that to worship the God of Israel properly, he needed to stand on Israel's earth, to create a small piece of Israel in the heart of Aram. While his theology would need refinement, God is not limited by geography. His heart was moving in the right direction. The transformation went beyond religious belief. His entire approach to power, pride, and position had been revolutionized. The man who had been insulted by simple instructions had learned the value of humble obedience. Nun stood in the Jordan River, looking at his arms, his hands, touching his face, examining what had happened to him. This was not gradual improvement. This was transformation. This was miracle. This was the power of the God of Israel made manifest in his flesh. He had come to Israel as a proud commander. He emerged from the Jordan as a changed man. Chapter 8. Faith awakens. Dripping with river water, restored in body, awakening in spirit, Nun returned to Elisha's house. But this time he came not with demands or expectations. He came with wonder, with gratitude, with the beginnings of genuine faith. His entire entourage accompanied him: soldiers who had witnessed the miracle, servants who had counseled him to obedience, attendants who had traveled this whole impossible journey. This time Elisha came out. The prophet stood before the commander, and Non spoke words that would echo through centuries of biblical teaching. "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," he declared, his voice carrying the conviction of one who has experienced the undeniable. "So please accept a gift from your servant." Everything he had brought, the silver, the gold, the fine garments, he urged upon the prophet. This was more than gratitude. This was a man trying to make sense of an experience that had shattered his understanding of reality. In his world, healers were paid. Services rendered required payment. Power exchanged hands through transactions. He needed to give something back to balance the scales, to make this miracle fit into categories he understood. But Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing," the prophet said firmly. Even when Non urged him repeatedly, pressed the gifts upon him, insisted that he must accept something, Elisha remained adamant. The refusal itself was a teaching moment, another lesson in a day full of revelations. A healing from God cannot be purchased. Divine power is not for sale. Miracles are not transactions. This was grace freely given, unearned, and unpayable. The God who healed Non wanted no payment except what the commander had already offered without realizing it: humility, obedience, and awakening faith. But Non, struggling to grasp this new theology, made one more request. If he could not pay for the miracle, perhaps he could at least take something back with him that would connect him to this God who had healed him. "If you will not accept payment," he said, "then please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." The request reveals so much about his transformation and his continued journey of understanding. He still thought in terms of geography and physical connection, that to worship the God of Israel, he needed soil from Israel. His theology was incomplete, his understanding still developing, but the sincerity was undeniable. He was declaring exclusive devotion to the God who had healed him, planning to bring Israel's God into his homeland, preparing to worship in Aram with earth from Israel under his feet. He made one more confession, revealing the complexity of his situation. "But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this." He was describing his duty as commander, accompanying his king into the temple of Aram's gods, supporting the king physically as he bowed, required by his position to participate in rituals he could no longer believe in. He was asking for grace in the midst of complicated realities, seeking to balance newfound faith with political obligations. Elisha's response was gentle. "Go in peace. No condemnation, no lecture, no demands for immediate perfect theological understanding or complete separation from his culture. Just blessing and release." The prophet recognized that faith is a journey, that transformation happens in stages, that God is patient with those taking their first steps toward him. Non departed, no longer just healed, but converted, no longer just cleansed, but changed, carrying with him earth from Israel and a story he would tell for the rest of his life. Chapter 9. A Converted Heart. As Non's chariots rolled away from Elisha's dwelling, they carried more than a healed commander. They carried a testimony that would spread through Aram and beyond. The servants who had witnessed everything would tell the story. The soldiers who had stood guard during the 7 washings would describe what they saw. The commander himself would become a living witness to the power of Israel's God. Consider what Non was bringing back to Damascus: 2 mule loads of Israeli soil, yes, but also a completely changed worldview. He had come seeking physical healing and received spiritual transformation. He had arrived as a worshiper of Aramean gods and was returning as a devotee of the God of Israel. He had traveled south as a proud military leader and was journeying home as a humble servant of the divine. His request for soil reveals the early, incomplete nature of his understanding, but also the sincerity of his conversion. In the ancient world, gods were often thought to be territorial, connected to specific lands and peoples. Non believed that to worship the God of Israel properly, he needed to stand on Israel's earth, to create a small piece of Israel in the heart of Aram. While his theology would need refinement, God is not limited by geography. His heart was moving in the right direction, and the transformation went beyond religious belief. His entire approach to power, pride, and position had been revolutionized. The man who had been insulted by simple instructions had learned the value of humble obedience. The commander who had expected grand ceremonies had discovered that God often works through ordinary means. The proud warrior had found that true strength sometimes looks like submission. His healing would become famous in both Israel and Aram. Every time someone saw his clean skin, they would ask what had happened. Every time he told a story, he would have to speak of his pride, his anger, his servant's wisdom, and the muddy Jordan River where everything changed. His very body became a permanent testimony to the God who heals beyond borders, who shows mercy to foreigners, who values humility over status. But the story was not quite finished. There was one more character who needed to make his choice. One more lesson about the corruption that can flourish even in the presence of miracles. Chapter 10. Gehazi's Greed. Gehazi had watched everything. As Elisha's servant, he had been present for the entire encounter with Non. He had seen the proud commander arrive with his impressive entourage. He had heard his master give the simple instructions that enraged the foreign warrior. He had learned of the healing at the Jordan. He had stood beside Elisha when Non returned, transformed and grateful, and impressing gifts upon the prophet. And he had watched his master refuse everything. Now as Nan's chariots disappeared down the road, Gehazi stood beside Elisha, and something dark stirred in his heart. He had served the prophet faithfully. He had witnessed miracles. He had been entrusted with prophetic ministry. But in this moment, all he could think about was what had just been refused. My master was too easy on Non, this Aramean, he muttered to himself, rationalizing what he was about to do. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him. Notice the twisted logic. He invoked God's name to justify greed. He convinced himself that Elisha had been wrong to refuse payment, that accepting gifts would actually be more appropriate. He saw an opportunity for personal gain and dressed it up in righteous language. This is how corruption often begins, not with obvious evil, but with seemingly reasonable justifications for doing what we want to do anyway. Gehazi ran after Non's chariots. When the commander saw someone pursuing him, he stopped and dismounted to meet this messenger, assuming Elisha had sent him with some additional instructional request. "Is everything all right?" Non asked, concern in his voice. "Everything is all right," Gehazi lied smoothly. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." And the lie was specific, detailed, calculated to seem believable. 2 young prophets, unexpected visitors, a reasonable request for modest gifts to support them. Gehazi had crafted his deception carefully, asking for less than Naaman had originally offered, making it seem like a small charitable need rather than personal greed. Naaman, grateful beyond measure for his healing, eager to give something back, responded with generous enthusiasm. "By all means, take 2 talents," he said, doubling what Gehazi had requested. He had the silver wrapped in 2 bags and gave them, along with 2 sets of clothing, to 2 of his servants who carried them back toward Elisha's house with Gehazi. When they got near the house, Gehazi took the bags from the servants and sent them away. He hid the silver and clothing inside the house, concealing the evidence of his deception. Then he went in and stood before his master as if nothing had happened, as if he had been there all along. Chapter 11. Judgment falls. Elisha looked at his servant, and Gehazi felt the weight of that gaze. Prophets see what others cannot. They know what has happened in their absence. They perceived the secrets of hearts. Gehazi had forgotten in his greed exactly whom he was dealing with. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Elisha asked, giving his servant one chance to tell the truth, one opportunity to confess and repent. "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Carthy replied, compounding his sin with another lie, choosing to persist in deception even when confronted by a man who spoke with God's authority. Then Elisha spoke words that must have frozen Gehazi's blood. "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money, or to accept clothes, or olive groves and vineyards, or flocks and herds, or male and female slaves?" The prophet had seen everything, every step of Gehazi's pursuit, every word of his lie, every moment of his deception. More than that, Elisha understood what Gehazi's actions represented, not just theft, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what prophetic ministry was about. Gehazi had witnessed the healing of Nan, had seen divine power manifest, had stood in the presence of miracle, and all he could think about was how to profit from it. He had treated God's gift as a business opportunity. He had seen the healing of a diseased commander as a chance for personal enrichment. He had exploited Nan's gratitude and violated his master's explicit refusal. He had lied to both the foreign commander and the prophet, and he had done it all in the name of the Lord, using religious language to justify spiritual corruption. The judgment was swift and severe. Nan's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever. In the ultimate irony, the disease that had been removed from the Aramean commander now fell upon the Israelite servant, and the healing that Gehazi had tried to exploit became the source of his own affliction. He left Elisha's presence with his skin leprous. It had become as white as snow. The disease he had witnessed being cured now marked his own flesh, a permanent reminder of the cost of greed, the danger of exploiting grace, the corruption that can infect even those who serve in ministry. Gehazi's tragedy illustrates a truth that echoes through all of Scripture. Proximity to divine power does not guarantee spiritual health. Being close to miracles does not prevent moral failure. Serving a prophet does not automatically make one prophetic. The same God who heals with grace also judges with righteousness. Themes and spiritual breakdown. Healing beyond borders. The healing of Nan shatters any notion that God's power is limited by national identity or ethnic boundaries. Here was a Syrian commander, a man from a nation that had raided Israel, taken captives, and fought against God's chosen people. By every measure of ancient religious thinking, he should have been outside the reach of Israel's God. Yet God not only healed him, but pursued him, orchestrated his journey, and revealed divine power specifically for this foreigner. This story challenges exclusive thinking about who deserves God's attention. The unnamed captive servant girl, the unlikely prophetic instructions, the healing of someone who had no claim on Israel's covenant, and all of it points toward a God whose mercy extends beyond tribal boundaries, whose grace reaches those we might consider outsiders, whose power works for the benefit of those who have been our enemies. Centuries later, Jesus would reference this story when teaching in his hometown synagogue. When the people of Nazareth rejected him, he reminded them that there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Nan the Syrian. There was not a popular teaching then, and it remains challenging now. God's grace often flows to unexpected recipients, demonstrating divine love that transcends our categories of deserving and undeserving. Pride versus obedience. Nan's initial response to Elisha's instructions reveals the fundamental conflict between human pride and divine requirement. He wanted a healing that matched his expectations, grand, impressive, worthy of his status. Instead, he received instructions that seemed beneath him, too simple to be miraculous, too ordinary to be divine. His journey from rage to obedience traces a path that many must walk in their relationship with God. We come with expectations about how God should work, what miracles should look like, how divine power should manifest. We expect ceremonies that honor our importance, processes that make sense to our understanding, interventions that fit our categories of impressive and meaningful. When God instead offers simple instructions, ordinary means, humble requirements, we face a choice. Will we insist on our expectations or submit to divine wisdom? The 7 washings in the Jordan required none to persist in obedience even when results were not immediately visible. After the first washing, nothing changed. After the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, still diseased. Each immersion required renewed choice to trust, continued willingness to look foolish, the ongoing commitment to obey, even when sight provided no confirmation. This is the nature of faith, not believing because we see, but obeying until we see, trusting that God's instructions carry purpose, even when that purpose is not yet evident. Faith through servitude. The unnamed captive servant girl stands as one of the most remarkable figures in the entire narrative. She had every reason to hate Non, to rejoice in his suffering, to see his disease as just punishment. Instead, she became the conduit of grace, speaking words that would lead to his healing. Her position was the lowest in the household, a foreign captive, a child, a servant. Yet her faith moved mountains. Her testimony triggered a journey. Her simple words set in motion events that would demonstrate God's power to nations. This pattern repeats throughout Scripture, God working through the overlooked, speaking through unexpected voices, using the powerless to confound the powerful. And the servant girl's faith was not complicated or theological. She simply knew that the prophet in her homeland could heal, and she cared enough about her master's suffering to tell him so. Her compassion toward her captor, her faith despite her circumstances, her willingness to speak up despite her low status, all of it reveals the nature of genuine faith, which operates independently of comfort, position, or personal benefit. Similarly, Anan's servants provided the wisdom that saved him from his pride when he was about to walk away from healing because the instructions offended his dignity. They gently reasoned with him, showed him the illogic of his position, and counseled him toward obedience. They risked their master's anger to tell him truth he needed to hear. Both the captive girl and the servants demonstrate that God often places crucial wisdom in the mouths of those society considers least important. Integrity and ministry. Gehazi's judgment serves as a sobering counterpoint to Nan's healing. While the Syrian commander experienced transformation through humility and obedience, the Israelite servant experienced judgment through greed and deception. The contrast is stark and intentional. The outsider who humbled himself was healed. The insider who exploited grace was afflicted. Gehazi's sin was not simply theft or lying, though both were present. His fundamental error was treating divine power as a commodity, seeing the healing of Nan as a business opportunity, exploiting someone's gratitude for personal gain. He violated the principle Elisha had established by refusing payment, that God's grace cannot be bought or sold, that miracles are not transactions, that ministry must not become mercenary. This warning echoes through the centuries to anyone involved in spiritual leadership or ministry. The temptation to monetize grace, so to exploit people's desperation, to treat divine power as a source of personal enrichment, these dangers are perennial. Gehazi's judgment reminds us that God takes seriously the integrity of those who represent him, that serving in ministry does not exempt us from moral requirements, that proximity to miracles does not prevent corruption. The fact that his descendants would carry the leprosy forever suggests that the consequences of spiritual corruption can extend beyond the individual. When those who minister in God's name violate that trust, they damage not only themselves but also those who follow them, creating cynicism and distrust that can last for generations. Epilogue. The warrior made whole. Non returned to Damascus transformed. Every journey back is different from the journey out, but his return carried weight that few journeys bear. He left Syria as a diseased commander seeking cure and returned as a healed believer carrying testimony. He departed as a worshiper of Aramean gods and came home as a devotee of Israel's God. He went south proud and angry and traveled back, humbled and grateful. Imagine his arrival in Damascus. The watchmen on the walls would have seen the dust of his chariots approaching. The people would have gathered to see if the journey had been successful. His wife would have waited anxiously for news. The king would have summoned him to hear the report. And when they saw his skin, clean, healthy, it restored like a child's, the questions would have flowed like water. What happened? Who healed you? How was it done? And Nan would have told them everything, not just about the healing, but about the journey that led to it, about the captive servant girl whose faith sparked hope, about the prophet who wouldn't come out to meet him, about the insulting instructions and his wounded pride, about servants who spoke wisdom, about 7 washings in a muddy river, about the change that came not when he expected it, but when he obeyed it, about the God who heals beyond borders, who values humility over status, who works through ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary transformation. His testimony would have spread through Damascus and beyond, challenging the religious assumptions of his culture, planting questions about the nature of divine power, demonstrating that the God of Israel was not limited to Israel. He would have worshipped on his imported soil, making sacrifices not to Rimmon or the other gods of Aram, but to the God who had made him whole. His very presence became a permanent witness to grace that crosses boundaries, power that serves love, and a God who pursues the lost even in foreign lands. But perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. Nan had learned that healing requires more than seeking cure. It requires humble submission to divine instruction, even when that instruction seems beneath us, offensive to our dignity, or contrary to our expectations. He discovered that miracles often come not through grand displays of power, but through simple obedience to quiet instructions. He found that the God who could heal his flesh was also committed to transforming his heart, teaching him lessons about pride, humility, obedience, and faith that would shape the rest of his life. Somewhere in Syria for the rest of his days, and when people looked at the clean skin of the commander of the armies, they saw a walking testimony to the power of Israel's God. His healing became a permanent sermon, his restoration a living witness, his transformation proof that the divine reaches beyond borders, breaks through pride, and offers wholeness to those willing to humble themselves and obey. The story ends with Nan healed and Gehazi diseased, a juxtaposition that captures the paradox of grace and judgment. The reality that God's power can both restore and afflict. The truth that proximity to miracles guarantees nothing, and that genuine faith often flourishes in unexpected places, while corruption can grow even in sacred spaces. And always at the center of it all, the muddy Jordan River, where a proud warrior became humble enough to be healed, where 7 simple washings accomplished what no physician could achieve, where obedience unlocked miracle, where a foreign commander met the one true God and was forever changed.